You're now watching the Mike Missanelli podcast on the BetRivers Network.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Mike Missanelli podcast. Beautiful spring day in the Delaware Valley. This is podcast, I think it's number 190, but we don't care anymore about the numbers. We try to give you the same quality, whether it's 1 or 190. We're doing this on Thursday, May 30th. It is brought to us by the great people at BetRivers. Don't forget to get the BetRivers app. You got the NBA Finals coming up. You can make some coin. Today, we're double teamed with baseball expertise. Doug Glanville, Tim Kurkjian, who will be part of the ESPN broadcast, the Phillies-Mets series in London next week, which leads us to our discussion of your Philadelphia Phillies. They have surged to the top of the power rankings, ESPN and The Athletic. They are number one. They salvaged the last game of a three-game series with the Giants yesterday. They get a day off today. They are 39-18 as a homestand starts tomorrow. 3 with, as they say in St. Louis, which I never knew, the Lou, with those city uniforms they had. I never got that, but they're playing the Lou 3, and then 3 against the Brewers, and then 2 against the disastrous Mets. And then it gets a little tough at Boston for 3, at Baltimore 3. So the schedule's starting to get a little tougher. But let's analyze what this Philly start means, and we'll go into some numbers. Great story by Scott Lauber, the Inquirer, detailing some numbers and what it looks like. And I think the general gist of the story was, just because you're on a pace to win 115 games, which the Phillies are right now, that doesn't necessarily guarantee World Series success. So we'll look at this closely. And the stats, in fact, say the opposite. And one example was the Seattle Mariners, who in the year 2004, I believe it was, 2001 Mariners won 117 games and didn't win the World Series and got eliminated. So it always boils down to a short series on whether you hit or whether you pitch. Phillies last year, they didn't hit in a series against the Arizona Diamondbacks and found that they got upset and we're not in the World Series. So the Phillies now are only the 24th major league team in 123 years to win at least 37 of their first 51 games. That's very impressive, right? But Rob Thompson is kind of downplaying that because he referred to that Mariners thing and he said, did they win? And of course they did not win. So it's pedal to the metal. That's why I like this manager. He doesn't overreact to anything. He keeps everything on an even keel. So you got to stay humble, and you got to keep doing the same thing that led to this. And what has led to this is your starting pitching. And see, this is the one thing that I think is a staple for the Phillies. Hitting can come and go, and even good hitters at the wrong time can go sour, and it screws up your whole team. But if your pitching is consistent, you're going to be in every game to the point where you don't stress out your offense. And this is a year where the Phillies starting pitching is as good as it's ever been from one to at least 4 of them, maybe not all 5 of them, with Taijuan Walker. But, Christopher Sanchez looks tremendous. And Reyes Suarez does. Those 2 guys really weren't supposed to be this good this year. So when you got the top with Wheeler and Nolan, you have those 2 guys. That's a pretty deep rotation. And that's a rotation you could take into the postseason and not worry about having to outslug teams. So what's the difference this year? You can always point to the pitching. The team that won in '93 was the team that carried the pitching, carried them. And in 2008, they hit. The pitching wasn't that good. But I think when you have good pitching, and Wheeler, Nola, and Ranger Suarez have a 2.68 ERA. That's better by more than a half a run than any National League team. The Cubs are good, but they're not as good as the Phillies. So last year, if you compare them, last year Philly starters have a 5.16 ERA in 287 innings through 57 games. Now, just think of that. They got off to a 25-32 start, and now you look at where they are now, and you can connect the dots. The starting pitching has given them what they are right now. So, listen, I've been on the record saying they could use another right-handed hitted outfielder who's a little more consistent, has a little pop. They could use a right-handed relief pitcher. I think they will add those 2. I think Dombrowski's smart enough to see the same thing that I see and that a lot of people see. And they'll fill in those kind of holes. So the only thing, like, you shudder to think that an injury could derail them, and an injury in the pitching staff would certainly derail them. But right now, I think Philly fans are feeling very, very confident. So when we look at the hot start, though, and this is an statistical analytical look at this, it doesn't guarantee when you start hot that you end hot, and that's the only thing that I worry about here. Here's an interesting stat: that the Phillies play 500 ball for the rest of the year. Let's say they play one game over 500, 53 and 52, since they have 108 games left. They would still win 92 games. And 92 games probably wins the division, even at 92 games. So you could just play, and they're not going to be mediocre. They can't possibly play close to 500 ball with this kind of a team. So if you want to go percentage-wise, Fangraphs and Baseball Reference give them a 97.7% chance and a 98.7% chance to make the playoffs and be the favorite to win the NL East. You look at the Braves. I've told you before, the only thing I worry about with the Braves, they're not the Phillies this year. They're not. They're not as dominant as they've been. They lost Acuna now, and they lost their number one starter. So they look like an 88 win team to me. And the only thing I worry about is that if they survive in their first round, they come in and play the Phillies with a lot less pressure than that's been on them in the past, and that's the only thing. That would be like the ultimate stab in the heart if you're a Philly fan, if that happens this year. But we got to bring it up because I want to present all sides here. Okay, so the Phillies have played mediocre opponents, and I look at that and I go, how could they not? The National League isn't very good this year. They're just not very good. I mean, you have the Dodgers, you have the Phillies, and then you can slot in other teams. Milwaukee's all right, the Cubs are all right, the Braves are all right, and the Giants. It's not a very deep National League here. So it doesn't matter to me that much that they really haven't played anybody because there's nobody to play. And if they're better than most of the teams that they play because the league is a little weaker, then I can't complain about that. Here's another stat. Of the previous 29 teams that lost a deciding game of best of 7 or best of 5 LCS, that's the Phillies. Only 5 made it to the World Series the following year. Now, you can't measure that on a level playing field because some teams are better than others that come into the following year. This Phillies team is actually better than the team that lost last year. So for me, that stat really does not apply. So I'm sitting here pretty confident about the Phillies this year. I think it's going to be a really fun summer. I think they're good enough to dominate the National League. I think they will probably win 100 games. And they will be, and it's a toss-up whether they're the number 1 or number 2 seed. In our last podcast, we talked about who they would play. Their number 1 seed in the second round, who they would play in the number 2 seed. Either team they would play would be inferior to what the Phillies are. Okay, let's bring Darren in for that. Darren, your views on all the numbers that we just crunched.
So one thing, Mike, that I think is really important this year is home field advantage throughout the National League playoffs, because that Dodger team, I know they don't look like themselves yet. They are going to be really good in the postseason. The Cubs have some really good pitching. I think to get to the World Series, that they really need to be the number 1 seed. That way, they got to come here. They got to win in this house. And not that the Phillies are unbeatable. They certainly, let us down against Arizona last year. But I really think that if they more than any other year, they need the number 1 seed. I'll feel a lot better about getting to the World Series if this Phillies team has the number 1 seed and the Dodgers have to come here for games 1.
Yeah, I don't think that in a baseball that's much of a factor. I really don't. I think if you have a better pitching staff, it doesn't matter. You're going to go on the road. You're going to win a game with a better pitcher. Yeah. And I think the Phillies are better.
But a lot of teams are beaten before they even come into Philly because they do. Let's be honest. They have probably the best home field advantage in baseball right now.
Yeah. Are you telling me Ranger Suarez wouldn't be able to win a game in Dodger Stadium?
No, they could.
So I don't really think that the home field, when you have an advantage in your pitching staff, I don't think that matters that much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we are joined by baseball royalty. See what I did there? Because I'm going to be talking about the London series. But truly, these guys are baseball royalty. Been around the game for a really long time. Doug Glanville and Tim Kurkjian are going to join us. They're going to be part of the broadcast while the Phillies take on those always tough New York Mets in London. Of course, Timmy hosting Is This a Great Game or What, as well as his ESPN duties on Sunday Night Baseball, TV and radio. And of course, Doug Glanville, the MLB analyst for ESPN Radio. He works with John Shambi a lot. He is co-host with my buddy, the podcast Starkville, and a former great center fielder. In fact, I've got Glanville ranked my #1 center fielder in Phillies history, with Gary Maddox second. Guys, how are you today?
I'm well, yeah. Mike. Thank you.
Yeah, doing great, man. Appreciate you having me. And the
you agree with
defense, man.
The best center fielder, Maddox, way down at #2. Like.
Yeah. I could never go over my mentor like that. Gary Maddox came to my wedding, so for that, I'll always be second to him. So
yeah, Gary, great guy, of course. How about we just settle for the best center fielder in University of Pennsylvania history, which is right. Kind of undisputed. Guys, let's talk about, first of all, the London series, and I want to get your assessment of the Phillies and what they're doing right now. But first of all, do you guys have any previous London experience? Have you been there? Are you connected route-wise? I think, Doug, you might be.
Yeah, well, there's no question I have. Well, if you go back to my dad was from Trinidad and Tobago, and he had two brothers, and they both kind of went their own directions at some point, going to England. One of the brothers stayed, one went back to Trinidad, and the uncle that stayed had two daughters, and one of his daughters is there in Brighton, and my other cousin from the uncle that went back to Trinidad, she's also in Brighton. So I have some family that I haven't seen in a little while, and they're very excited. So that's the fun part about it. But it's been a minute since I've been to London, so all the more exciting for me.
So as a youth, were you hanging out with your cousins in England?
Well, they moved. One went back to Trinidad, went to law school in England. So I didn't really see them a lot in the kind of younger days, except in stateside. And the two sisters that came to the U.S., they pretty much stayed there until my older cousin, she went back fairly recently, within the last 5 years. And that was her dream. She was born there, and she's like, I always wanted to go back. She always had GB, stickers on her car as if she was driving a British car. She was like, I'm going home. And when she got the window to go, she went back, and she's loving it. So I'm looking forward to seeing her.
That's very cool. All right, now, so how are you guys planning to cover this? I know you're going to get there early. I assume you'll get there by Tuesday or what, Timmy? And so what's the blueprint on how you'll cover the week before we actually get to the games?
Right. Well, I covered last year also. I did the Cubs and the Cardinals in England last year. And I was fascinated, I must say, by how interested the players were in where they were. They all went to castles. They went to Westminster Abbey. And I had some really long conversations with Major League Baseball players about something other than baseball. I mean, Paul DeYoung, the shortstop for the Cardinals last year, looked at me at the batting cage and he said, isn't it amazing how all great civilizations are built on a river? That's what he told me at the batting cage. And I got equally profound thoughts from Miles Michaelis and from other people. Miles Michaelis told me when he played in Japan, he said, I can remember 3 games that I played in 3 years in Japan, but I'll never forget being in Japan for 3 years, the places I went. So that's what struck me more than anything, is those players were actually interested in England. Cody Bellinger looked at me with a smile on his face, and he goes, we went to Westminster Abbey today. I've never seen anything like that. So that was very encouraging to me, that instead of talking about sliders on the black, we talked about a church that was built 1,000 years ago.
That thought would probably stun people because I think the perception is that baseball players aren't very deep, and they just grind it out or whatever. So, unless you're like Glanville, you're an Ivy Leaguer. But were you surprised at that, Tim? You covered baseball 100 years, and I don't know if you could write an intellectual book about baseball players.
Well, I was very surprised and pleasantly surprised. And I'm also from my mother grew up in Bournemouth, which is about 90 miles south of London. That's where she was born. She moved here when she was 22. We visited multiple times when I was a kid. So I have a connection to all those in London. And it was really important for me to go back to where my mother was born. And I grew up to stories of cricket and rounders. And my mother used to play netball. My mother was a great athlete, by the way. She used to play netball. Try to figure this. It's basketball, but there's no backboard. It's just like a rim stuck on a pole. So that's how I grew up, with a mother who grew up in England. Needless to say, she came to this country, met my father, had 3 baseball-crazed boys. She learned a lot about baseball very quickly because she had no choice.
That's pretty amazing that both you guys have that kind of a connection to over the pond. So during the week, are you talking to Londoners? Or are you talking to like what will you do? What kind of interviews will you be doing there before the actual games take place?
Yeah, well, we're going to Trafalgar Square on Friday, and we're going to ask people a lot of questions. I did the man on the street stuff last year. Of course, I asked Michael Kay, was the broadcaster. I said, do you know who Michael Kay is? And I asked like 20 people. Not one person knew who he was. I said, do you know who Tim Kurkjian is? No one knew who I was, of course, as if I care. And then I asked one guy who actually knew who Alex Rodriguez was, because he was also on the show. And he said, yeah, I really enjoyed watching him play for the Oakland A's, which, of course, he never played for the Oakland A's. But that's the closest I got to an acknowledgement that they knew the people who were calling the game.
Okay, so Doug, this is a question for you then. What is the purpose of this series? Like from the stories that Tim just told, they're not really plugged into Major League Baseball. So what are we trying to do here with these series?
Well, we want to teach everybody what is a Philly and what is a Met. I think that question would stump like Americans. So, I think it's great. The game is really just trying to give some international love and get, recognize that this game has, global potential. And certainly there's many countries represented in the game. Whether obviously Japan and Latin America. So I think it's just an opportunity to expose and having a cultural exchange. And you see the popularity like a show like Ted Lasso, right? Like I didn't really watch soccer, English soccer or anything, but I took an interest, right? So you see the cultural exchange that baseball has this potential, and it is a game that comes from a lot of different places historically. So I love the idea, and for me, one fun thing that's going on for me is there's a show called Money Heist on Netflix, and Terry Francona turned me on it. And towards the end of the last season, there's a song by a group called Star Sailor. And I love the song.
I know Star Sailor. I have a CD. That guy's voice is fantastic.
Fantastic, right? James Walsh, right? So I tweeted them, and he actually wrote me back. And I was like, oh. So we kind of built a connection. And I ended up looking into their catalog, and I found this perfect song for the intro. So I wrote a poem, and I got James Walsh's approval. We ended up emailing back and forth. So it's fun. I wanted to figure out how can I fuse this idea that British music and the way culturally we exchange. There's an opportunity to kind of expose obviously the UK, but also just the fact that it goes the other way as well. So I wrote this poem almost introducing what baseball is like in almost a spiritual way, so that you understood the rules, but at the same time I'm not talking about sliders on the black. And so that's been fun. It's the collaboration to try to really create this moment where you're bridging more than just the game. You're really kind of culturally exchanging.
Timmy, I know this you'll be able to produce an answer to this right away. What major leaguers have come from England?
There have been very, very few. We looked up one yesterday. James Reed pitched for the Dodgers a couple games. He was born in England. That's about the only guy we can find. And I don't want to ruin anything here, but when I did the WBC a couple years ago, I visited the British team knowing I would be going to England, and I couldn't find one player on the team that grew up in England, in London, let's say, played baseball in Little League, middle school, high school, 'cause there was no such thing. The players came from Trinidad and Tobago. They came from the islands around. So I'm not going to hide the fact that I couldn't find anyone who played baseball in Great Britain, because that's not what they do.
Yeah, but I assume they don't have a feeder system for baseball. Right?
They don't. They just don't have it like, say, Australia and a bunch of others. They play other sports there, but I must say they were intrigued by baseball, having seen those two games there last year that I watched.
I find that people, it's funny because you get into conversations with cricket players and they completely don't understand baseball. And I look at cricket and I go, what kind of, compared to baseball, it's not even half the game baseball is. But the cricket obsession over there is just amazing to me. And baseball's so much a better game. I'm reasoning if those people grew up with baseball alongside cricket, more would gravitate to baseball. Would you agree?
Well, I wonder because you're also mixing this idea of tradition, and in the British culture, when you talk about a society that's like 8 billion years old and they came when Mars was formed, it's like, wait a minute, so culturally, like the British Empire was so big, like everybody was kind of like a farm team, so so they kind of had baseball because everybody was under their umbrella. Yeah. My dad played cricket, and so I remember in Trinidad, and then him coming to Howard University. And I still didn't, know all the rules, but I understand, 6 and 4 and, how you get the points. Brian Lara was a legendary cricket player who, came from Trinidad. So, he got like 400 in one night. You could play like 3 nights in a row and stuff. So, yeah, so I think that, well, that's the exchange. Like you're hoping like, oh, let me try your rules. Let me see. Okay, let's add this. And maybe we'll get some new rules.
The game's going for days. I remember being in Bermuda watching a cricket match went on for days, and then we're going, but foul balls are hits in this kind of sport. Right. Like that's I don't really get.
Sorry, Mike. Last year we went to a cricket bar where they had, like, instead of a batting cage, they had a cricket cage. So I had to try to hit a cricket ball thrown out of a machine, much like a pitching machine, and I'm using a cricket bat, which is like trying to swing a boat oar. And it's the first batting practice I've taken since my senior year in high school, so it had been a while. It was a fascinating exercise, but the place was packed, and these
it's really
were
crazy.
Hitting cricket balls all over this bar for like 4 hours that we were there. It was wild.
I love guys that take full swings, but I also love guys that just tick it, like
and just block it.
Yeah, it's crazy. All right, let's talk a little bit about the Phillies, guys, and the start that they're on is pretty amazing. They're 39-18, and now this brings up previous examples of teams that ran away, like the Mariners winning 118 games or whatever that was. And so, like, what do you make of this start? They haven't really played a lot of good teams. But you beat the teams that are in front of you, and there's something to be said about that. So, is this real, and where do you think it leads here?
Well,
go ahead. Doug.
This is absolutely real. I mean, this team is loaded, and it starts with the fact that they have pitching. I mean, they just have really good pitching, and although the starter doesn't mean what it used to be in going 9, it means still a lot to go 6. It means a lot to set up your bullpen in ways that are at their best. And it means a lot to save your bullpen and have your matchups. And that's what they're really doing well. I mean, Ranger Suarez, these cats are, they already had Wheelers and, Nolas of the world. And they have a lot of different kinds of guys in the pen that can give you different looks. Lefty power, finesse, sinker ballers, closers. So that just starts there. And then if the offense, which can be fickle and has had their struggles last couple of years early, when they're clicking, that's just a team that's really hard to beat because they can already beat you in the 2-1 games. Now they score 5, 6, 7, you're in trouble. So there's nothing shocking. I mean, I had the Phillies win the division, over the Braves, and it's in part because I love their rotation, but if they hit it all, which they certainly always had the potential to do, Harper getting hot and all that, then yeah, they're where they should be.
Timmy, you covered a lot of baseball in your day, but it's not an indicator if you win triple-digit games that you're going to succeed in the World Series. In fact, very few teams have done it. So, what could go wrong?
I'm with Doug. I see nothing wrong with the Phillies at this point. If this starting pitching stays this good, they're going to be the team to beat. Maybe in the National League, maybe in the major leagues. If Ranger Suarez is this good. By the way, Brad Miller, former major leaguer, told me during the postseason last year, he just volunteered to me. He said, watch the guy that makes the biggest breakthrough next year. This will be our next great pitcher, Ranger Suarez. He said that in October. We all know he was a pretty darn good pitcher going into this year, but of course he's reached another level. So there's nothing not to like about the Phillies right now. When Turner comes back, they're going to score more runs. The entire bullpen seemingly throws 98 miles an hour. But when you have that kind of starting rotation, you've got a chance.
Doug, you played for this organization. Timmy, in Baltimore, the backdrop, you were well aware of the history of the Phillies and the pressure on teams to win here. This year almost seems like they're setting up the fan base because they're so good that if they don't win the whole thing, I could see just a colossal meltdown disappointment with the fans. That last year we got a taste of it when they lost to Arizona. But if they don't win this year, after setting their fan base up for this kind of thing, what do you think happens?
Well, of course, the Philly fans are going to let you know regardless. That's the intensity of the community of Philly fans. I was a Philly fan growing up, so and I saw those great '70s teams, and finally winning in '80. But I'd rather be, and I think any fan would rather be in a position to have the luxury of being frustrated when you lose in the World Series, because every year you have a shot. And Rob Thompson took over and has done a really wonderful job. And this year it was very clear that he's like, I want to get off to this good start, because last year, they had to kind of boat race their way back into it the years before. And so there's certain luxury, but there's certain responsibility of being ahead, because now you got to kind of maintain that intensity. And I don't think you're going to have that problem in Philadelphia. So they're going to keep you on it. But Alex Boehm, guys like this, like taking it another level is kind of the definition. And it's not shocking, because think about the young guys. Bryson Stott, they were in the World Series. They were like, where am I, right? And now they're like 2 years later, they're just there's a calm. It's like, okay, we're supposed to be here. And they're very balanced and experienced and skills. So I think the Philly fans are I'm sure they're thrilled. And they'll hold their breath through the postseason. But right now, the Phillies do look like the best team in baseball.
Right, and I think they are too. And I'm with you, Mike. There's going to be some upset people if they don't win the World Series. But the same thing's going on with the Yankees right now. If they don't win the World Series, that fan base is going to be upset, and especially the Dodgers if they don't win the World Series. So the Phillies will not be alone here. There are other fan bases that will be upset if their team. Just one quick reminder, as we know, this is baseball. Anything can happen in October. Bad teams, or the ninth playoff team never went into Chicago Stadium and beat Jordan's team 2 out of 3. It's impossible, and it doesn't happen in football nearly as often. But baseball, last year, perfect example, 84-win team barely gets in and winds up in the World Series. This is why the sport is the best of all, is that we get to October and anything is possible.
Here's what can happen, Tim. I'm looking at the playoffs as they stand right now. If we assume the Phillies will get that first round bye, the second round series will be most likely against the Braves. Now the Braves are not expected to win now, because of various circumstances. They were expected to win 2 previous series against the Phillies, and they came in and they just got blown away in Philadelphia because they got spooked by whatever they got spooked by. Now they come in with absolutely not that pressure on them. And my biggest fear for Philadelphia fans is that the Braves somehow upset them after years where they were supposed to beat the Phillies. This year they're not, and they do. Is that fatalistic?
I mean, no,
is that fatalistic Philly view?
Well, I mean, maybe a little bit, but it's look, the Braves and the Dodgers last year, it did not shock me they got knocked out. It did not, because their pitching was in shambles. All right, 4 out of the 5 starters of the Dodgers were hurt, out, for whatever issue they had. The Braves, after you got Strider and then you're like Morton, they're like, well, what's happening, right? Max Fried's hurt, whatever. So I think there's always a different storyline when you get to the postseason. And as you saw with the Diamondbacks, they had 2 really good starters, and it was like, watch out. If you run into them and they win those games, trouble. So, yeah, I think there's a possibility. Yes, the Braves are still good, and they have a great offense even without Acuna Jr. So it is scary, but they beat them last year. so they got to kind of go in like knowing it. Because I certainly never beat the Braves. I never beat the Braves. I just stared at their backs for 10 years or whatever. So
Yeah, it's another fatalistic Philly view. What could go wrong, which we think about a lot here in Philadelphia. Let me just, before I let you guys go, I want to talk about just a couple of offbeat things that happened in baseball. So we'll start with yesterday, because I want to get Doug. I want to get your perspective on Harper. Took some chin music yesterday. One hit down with his bat. He wasn't very happy about it, and that ignited the entire team. Now, is that because it's Bryce Harper? Like, explain, because a lot of people look at that and they go, "That's silly." Because here come the bullpen guys. But it's almost like you, as a baseball player, you have to do that. Otherwise, you're kind of a coward who's hiding somewhere in the dugout or the clubhouse or the bullpen. So, explain what goes through the mind of a baseball player when that kind of thing happens.
Well, yes, you have to be out there. First of all, the only guy I saw not go out there is in the minors. My roommate Mike Carter. Because we got fined like $300 and suspended without pay, and he's like, I can't afford it. So he stayed on the bench and he just waved to everybody. He's like, I'm not getting fined. So these guys can certainly afford it. And by the way, I have a thread. We have an alumni thread of the Phillies. It's all my 90s and 2000 guys. Pat Burrell's on it. And you know who got ejected at that fight, that little dust-up.
Yeah, he got in there and pushed them.
Right, so we in a text message, we were like, Pat, what's up? He's like, no comment, right? So, yeah, you have to get out there. Look, Harper, his maturity, it's so heartening because he came up a young, brash dude, but always loved the game and knew the history of the game. And just watching how he just like has such perspective and still can have that intensity, it's really amazing. And the fact that he was calm later and said, look, he's not throwing at me. But yeah, he's upset because, you trust the command of your opponent. Just like you dive back to first base, the first baseman got to catch the ball or it's going to hit you in the face. So you have to have that trust, and if someone doesn't have command, it's upsetting. And I think in protection of Harper, you come out. He was upset, so your teammates read that and you get there. Didn't necessarily throw a punch, but you got to have your teammates back, and that's just kind of what you do.
Timmy, for you, the Jorge Lopez situation yesterday, as it turned out, he didn't actually say what they thought he said. He was saying that he was a bad teammate, and something was lost in translation there. But I know you've probably seen a couple of episodes like that. What was your reaction when you saw that?
Well, I haven't seen too many pitchers throw their glove into the stands before. Their glove is your most personal item. I think Doug will acknowledge that. You don't see that very often, and I think obviously this just speaks to the frustration of the Mets. They have lost 4 games in May that they led into the 9th inning. 4 games in 1 month. That's the frustration, and they had a team meeting after the game. I'm sure Lopez isn't going to be long for the Mets after what he did with the struggles he and everyone else has had there, but that was unique. This happens in baseball. I've said it 1,000 times. Every night you go to the ballpark, you might see something you've never seen before. I don't think I've ever seen a pitcher throw his glove into the stands after being ejected.
Yeah, they DFA'd him. But I don't think this does you guys any favors. With the Phillies are playing that mess of a team right now in London.
Yeah, well, no, they're both seemingly going in their own directions, but that's the fun of it. I don't know. Maybe the fact that they're counting on jet lag on the other team or some strategy, but you got to do it on the field. So maybe someone loves like tea, different flights of tea. My cousin loves to provide that. So I know the rivalry is still there, even if you're another country and even if one team is absolutely playing their worst baseball.
Guys, listen, I really appreciate you doing this, and always insightful, and good luck with the broadcast. Tim Kurkjian and Doug Glanville will be broadcasting the Phillies-Mets series in London, and Michael Kay will be the play-by-play guy. Have some fun out there and bring us some really interesting stories. And thanks for coming on the Mike Missanelli podcast. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Mike.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so that's your Phillies talk for today. Let's get into the Sixers. All we have right now are rumors about who they want to acquire, because the big rumor, we've talked about it before, is Paul George, and the other one is Jimmy Butler. In both cases, they would have to pay the max. The max for Paul George is a little more than it would be for Jimmy Butler, but they're both substantial. And then there's discussions that they would possibly make a trade, and the trade that they would make is for Brandon Ingram of the New Orleans Pelicans. He's a nice wing. I don't think he's turned into the superstar a lot of people thought he would be, but he's a lot younger. And I would rather go with the younger guy, even if it's a trade that you have to give up some assets for. I think that would be worth it a lot more than going out. I don't know how Jimmy Butler will play at age 35. It's funny. People look at it and they think they're getting the same Jimmy Butler that left here. You're not. And you're not getting the same Paul George as 6 years ago. People have a tendency to think, oh my God, the name itself plays out as the superstar. Not necessarily, because then you have to worry about how much time they miss during the regular season. You have to worry about whether they have anything left for the playoffs. When you're older, it changes the landscape. So I don't think Daryl Morey really puts enough emphasis into that thought process. So we're in a holding pattern with the Sixers, and we'll see what they do from this point on. All right, that'll do it for today's podcast. I want to thank Tim Kurkjian and Doug Glanville, and we'll hear those guys next week when the Phillies play the New York Mets. Everybody have a great rest of the day. You can get in touch with me, Mike at MikeMiss.com, and check me out on Twitter at MikeMiss25. For Darren, I'm Mike. Thanks for listening, everybody. Don't forget to subscribe to the Mike Missanelli podcast. It's free. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.